Council and to the Commission. This is about the negotiations for a new EU-ACP partnership agreement. The first speaker is the Rapporteur, Mr. Venter.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner Mimica, dear Minister Panayotova, I would like to speak on behalf of Ms. Linda McEwan, the Chair of the Committee on Development, because she cannot be here this evening. The Cotonou Agreement with the countries of Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific concerns the Union's cooperation with 78 countries. One of the 5 people of the world's population live in those countries, and the proportion is set to rise. No other partnership agreement of the EU has a similar geographic scope. The Cotonou Agreement covers trade, development, cooperation and a political dimension. It provides a detailed list of human rights and democratic principles that the parties must comply with. The agreement expires in February 2020 and negotiations must be launched by August this year. Many stakeholders have been consulted over the past 2 years and the partnership has been completely evaluated. Also within the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, we've discussed the future of the cooperation beyond 2020. Also, our Parliament contributed to the reflection by a resolution prepared by my colleague Norbert Neuser that was adopted in October 2016. This resolution stressed that the next agreement should maintain the acquis of the Cotonou Agreement, notably the legally binding nature of the agreement, the political dialogue, and the essential elements as respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, democratic principles, the rule of law, and good governance. Ahead of this adoption of the mandate, our Development Committee thought it would be useful to present the EP priorities for the upcoming negotiation, taking into account that Parliament needs to give its consent to the final agreement and that it should also be fully and regularly informed about the negotiation while they are ongoing. We understand that agreeing on the mandate with Council is taking longer than expected and proves difficult. Dear Commissioner, dear Ms. Minister, as you have seen in the question addressed to you, the Parliament has a number of concerns relating notably to the consequences of the shift towards regional compacts on the preservation of a strong overarching ACP cooperation. The question of the balance between the 3 regional components is also important in view of the enhanced partnership with Africa. Political dialogue is a fundamental part of the Cotonou Agreement and must remain a central and legal pillar of the overarching framework and at the regional level. We believe that the effectiveness of the political dialogue should be improved, notably through a better monitoring of the human rights situation in the partner countries. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in particular SDG 17, stresses the need for true multi-stakeholder partnership. There is a need for a reinforced role for parliaments, civil society and regional and local authorities, starting right from the phase of negotiating the new agreement. The new partnership is perceived as one going beyond aid and going further than a recipient-donor relationship. This is very welcome. We insist on the need to put the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs and the European Consensus on Development at the heart of the future ACP-EU partnership. The eradication of poverty should remain a central element of this future agreement, and we should live up to the 2030 Agenda commitment to leave no one behind. With this debate, we would like to receive more information on the future institutional design and the future interplay between the Joint Council and the Joint Parliamentary Assembly. Let me take the opportunity to repeat the importance of strengthening the parliamentary dimension of the future agreement, guaranteeing real consultative power for the future overarching GPA, and ensuring that it provides for open, democratic and comprehensive parliamentary dialogue. The ACP-EU GPA is an innovative institution, and we should take the opportunity of the future agreement to consolidate its legitimacy. The European Parliament believes that the Assembly should be closely associated with the implementation of the agreement and that it should be regularly consulted on all matters of importance for the partnership. Last but not least, the ACP side has decided to widely disseminate the negotiating mandate of the ACP group of states. Can the Presidency promise that the Council will publish the negotiating directives? And also, will the Commission publish textual proposal during the negotiation? I look forward to your answer, and thank you very much for your attention.
Kiitokset edustaja Venta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Venta. The next speaker in this debate is the Council, and Monika Panayotova has the floor.
Thank you, President, honourable members. Thank you for your question, which gives us the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. ACP-EU relations after 2020 have been high on the agenda of all the presidencies in the past 4 years, and the Bulgarian presidency has had the privilege of taking the lead at a very crucial moment. The Cotonou Agreement set a clear deadline for the start of the negotiations between the two parties, and the presidency spared no efforts to finalise the EU preparation process so that negotiations can be opened already before the summer break. Our relations with the ACP countries are at an important juncture. We have all been witnessing the significant changes since the signatures of the Cotonou Agreement. The world, the European Union and the ACP themselves are not the same anymore. Our own reality has become much more complex. The European Union has 13 member states more than in 2000, and the ACP countries have also developed in various different ways. Cooperation and interdependence at global level have gained even more importance in recent years, and relying on alliances is a key element of the European Union vision of multilateral values and principles on the international stage. The Council took the upcoming negotiations with the ACP as a clear opportunity to strive for a new framework that responds best to these new challenges. I am happy to note that the European Parliament shared this approach since the beginning. There was also a convergence of views from early on with the ACP side that the new framework needs to be adapted to the new reality so that we can address global challenges more efficiently. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda will be the backbone of the new ACP-EU relationship. The EU position is therefore embedded in the European Consensus for Development and the new EU Global Strategy. Honourable members, the Council is in the very final stage of an extremely intense discussion process to agree on the negotiating mandate. Its length is commensurate to the importance we give to our future relation with the ACP states. With only one outstanding issue, a very large majority of the negotiating mandate is agreed. The Presidency is confident that the last open issue can be resolved in the coming days so that the negotiations with the ACP side can be opened shortly. The vision of the European Union member states is clear. We want to bring about a major change. Our aim is to leave behind the limitations of the donor-recipient relationship for good and open a new chapter with a bond between equal partners. Development, while an important part of our relations, should become one of the many areas of a complex, more political architecture. The ACP group has great aspirations, and we are convinced that the two parties together can become a driving force on important global issues. Let me give you an example. In the area of climate change, our joint efforts have been exceptionally fruitful. The ACP-EU Council of Ministers adopted the ACP-EU Joint Declaration on Climate Change on the 1st of June, ahead of the upcoming conference in December. With Poland taking over the chairmanship of the COP from Fiji, this allows us to maintain joint ACP-EU efforts over 2 mandates and steer our common agenda further ahead. This successful example needs to be replicated in other areas of global importance. On the EU side, we are convinced that we can do it and are putting all our energy into achieving this. Honourable members, the ACP-EU architecture is very complex, and the different levels need to be readjusted to our new reality. The situation on the ground differs between regions and countries, and regional and local actors are gaining more and more importance. The EU intends to respond to this by shifting the centre of gravity and proposing tailor-made, action-oriented regional partnerships. We need to act at the most appropriate level in line with the principle of subsidiarity and to enhance the efficiency of the ACP-EU partnership. Our ambition is to agree on a more political framework with the ACP side. The new framework is intended to encompass all relevant subject matters of joint interest, such as human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, the rule of law and good governance, human development, sustainable and inclusive growth, peace, security and justice, as well as mobility and migration. This includes a strong commitment to the principle of leaving no one behind, which is not at all in contradiction with the objective of a modernised political partnership that goes beyond the traditional development aid approach. It's quite the opposite. Only a comprehensive political partnership will put us in the position to build peaceful, well-governed and prosperous states and societies by accelerating progress towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and thus eradicate poverty and tackle discriminations and inequalities. I would like to thank you for the valuable input of the European Parliament, and I count on your continued support as we pursue this important work. Thank you.
Kiitokset neuvostolle tästä puheenvuorosta.
Thank you very much to Council. And the next to speak is the Commission, Commissioner Mimica.
Honourable members, I would like to thank the Parliament, in particular the DEVE Committee Chair Linda McEwan and honourable members Venta and Neuser for the excellent work on this important file. I welcome your resolution and the question on the upcoming negotiations of the partnership agreement between the European Union and the countries of the African, Caribbean and Pacific group of states. Your position on the way forward and that of the Commission are broadly aligned. We share the conviction that we need a legally binding agreement that is based on the essential elements of our existing partnership, namely the respect for human rights, democratic principles, rule of law and good governance. They are a core part of the acquis and must be strengthened in a new agreement. I also agree with your call to preserve a strong ACP identity. Together, the European Union and ACP countries represent more than half of the UN membership. Such an alliance should be further exploited. Keeping the framework with 79 countries is fully compatible with having a tailored and strengthened approach to cooperation with the main regions. Africa will remain very much in focus in the years to come. The future EU-Africa pillar should build on the existing joint Africa-European strategy and use its institutional setup. At the same time, the importance of our Caribbean and Pacific partners will also be confirmed. The institutional and political architecture of the new EU-ACP partnership agreement will be key to this. Each region should have a distinct governance and a focus on regionally relevant priorities for dialogue and cooperation. The political dialogue must be an integral part of the new partnership at all levels, including the ACP-wide level, the continental, regional and national levels, and through the format most appropriate to the issues discussed. I also agree with your insistence that a core principle of the new partnership agreement should be a multi-stakeholder approach to dialogue and cooperation. Let me also reassure you that the new partnership will fully confirm the commitment to implement the UN 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Eradicating poverty and leaving no one behind will remain core in our relationship with the ACP countries, which will cover all topics where there are mutual interests. I also agree with you that the role of parliaments should be reinforced. Regional parliaments, in particular, should be stronger, matching the increased prominence of EU-Africa, EU-Caribbean and EU-Pacific regional councils in the future EU-ACP agreement. As regards the rhythm of meetings, the Commission has proposed that the ACP EU Council should be convened on an ad hoc basis. The Joint Parliamentary Assembly should work closely with the ACP Council of Ministers, according to those same principles. Lastly, concerning the publication of the negotiating directives, the Commission has suggested that the Council publishes the final EU negotiation directives. It is ultimately with the Council itself to decide on what it considers the most appropriate course to follow. Our counterparts in the ACP group have adopted their negotiating mandate a few days ago at the ACP Ministerial Council in Lomé. Now it's up to the Council of the European Union to adopt ours. President, honourable members, I look forward to debate on this important topic. Thank you.
Kiitokset komissaari Mimica.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mimica. Now we move to the political group speakers, and we begin with Frank Engel for the EPP. 1.5 minutes, please. President, Commissioner, I don't have a great deal of time, so I just essentially want to say 3 things. Firstly, there is a reason to maintain the framework of ACP relations that we have now, and that is the strategic reason because between the 2 blocks we represent a majority of members of the United Nations, as it were. So given what's going on in the world at the moment, given what's happening in terms of development cooperation and so on, I think it would be appropriate to vigorously recall to our ACP partners that they have a privileged partnership with us. I also wouldn't like us to simply get lost in trivialities. I mean, civil society and all this stuff, I mean, it's all fine, but what we're interested in is that we can ensure a stable functioning states, particularly for our African partners. I mean, you can't develop anything in the Central African Republic, for example, without security. They need troops, and we refuse to fund those, for example. I mean, you can't develop without security. And then, just to conclude, there is a certain dichotomy that we need to resolve in terms of Africa, because the African Union covers the whole continent, and we need to find a way of ensuring that our specific relations with Africa can be part of our relations with the ACP countries. The north of Africa, well, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's an element that hasn't been included and needs to be. So I think the major focus in the future really needs to be for us to have a strategic relationship with the whole of Africa. Thank you.
Kiitokset edustaja Engel. Ja sitten Euroopan
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. Next on the list is Mr. Guerrero Salom for the Socialists and Democrats group. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, since the adoption of the Cotonou Agreement in 2000, and indeed during its revisions in 2005 and 2010, there have been many changes in the world. New players have emerged. There's a certain degree of chaos on the world stage, and the time has undoubtedly come, as we prepare to move into the next stage, for us to bear in mind 3 fundamental objectives. First of all, we need to strengthen our political dialogue. Many of the ACP players are now playing key roles in a multipolar world, and the European Union shares with them strategic goals in the way we provide order for the world. Secondly, we have to contribute to economic development. In many of these countries, most of which find themselves in poverty, investments are required. They need capacity to provide their citizens with opportunities. Thirdly, we have to cooperate with them in pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. Together, we account for more than half the members of the United Nations, And together we will be in a position to move forward, reducing poverty. If we do so, we will have made significant progress right around the world. Of course, we are calling for a stronger presence of parliamentary scrutiny in the implementation of the new Cotonou Agreement. We want to retain the ACP structure, while at the same time stressing the importance of regional integration within its scope. We wish to enhance accountability, and there are two fundamental points I wish to refer to. The most important thing is that we cannot bind cooperation with these countries to their fulfillment of our demands in terms of migration policy. We have to fight poverty, and that means we shouldn't make our assistance conditional. And the second, of course, is that there has to be respect for human rights, and that has to be the guiding axis of our cooperation. Thank you.
Kiitokset edustaja Guerrero Salom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guerrero Salom. The next speaker comes from the European Conservatives and Reformists Group, Mrs. Theocaros, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. The main objective of a strong partnership between the EU and the ACP is to eradicate poverty and to promote a sustainable economic, cultural, social development of the partner countries with their progressive integration of their economies in the world economy. Both EU and ACP countries should benefit from this partnership and exchange of experience. The mandate of negotiations for the future agreement was approved 2 weeks ago in Togo. In the framework of this mandate, the fundamental principles of the Cotonou Agreement should be maintained and should be part of our future agreement. The support and fostering of human rights and democratic principles, the development of policies for building peace and reinforcing security in vulnerable areas, tackling migration and climate change, combating terrorism, and finally tackling food insecurity are fundamental issues that should be tackled. The political dialogue should remain a central pillar in the more general framework of the agreement, whereas the principles of effective developmental cooperation should be incorporated fully in a new agreement. Finally, on a practical level, I strongly believe that the European Union should play a pivotal role in education and in fostering skills for the ACP peoples by supporting them to remain in their countries and to work for their countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, and thank you for your patience. And I also thank the interpreters for having the patience to deal with us despite the problems that they have to deal with themselves.
Kiitos edustaja Theocarous. Ja sitten edustaja...
Thank you very much, Mrs. Theocarous. Mr. Michel now for the ALDE Group. Please, 2 minutes.
Madam President, Commissioner, Cotonou had the great merit of bringing together development aid, trade and a political character of our relations, and that was part of the constituent spirit of that agreement, and it shouldn't only be preserved, but as I see it, it should be amplified quite ambitiously in a legally binding agreement, and we mustn't miss this unique opportunity. We must end up with being proper partners, and this then will set us on the right track, linked economically, environmentally, ethically and politically, and I'm thinking about real equality for men and women, real human migration policy. I'm thinking about legitimacy of authority no longer being able to be arbitrarily questioned. And I can understand the proposal for a pillar structure with a crown on the top of it. The base of it is a little bit like what we already have, but I have to draw attention to the risk that exists for our relations with Africa. if we put things into too tight a structure, the Pacific and the Caribbean, in their geographic and natural arenas, and I think if we think about this huge free trade area covering both continents, and if it is to respect the bilateral relations that we have, that would be an efficient arrangement that undermines the morale of Africans and Europeans. But what we need to do is offer young Africans and Europeans a prospect for never before seen development, and I think that then would be the only solution to get us out of the difficulty that we find ourselves in and to manage migratory flows. I can't see a better way to support the migration pact proposed by Antonio Guterres of the UN, and I totally support the argumentation outlined by Mr. Engel that this would give the possibility to Africans in the world that would be far greater than they have. And this is a vision of the Cotonou Agreement that would finally put paid to the populists with their rhetoric, saying, absolutely, yeah, it's really important, that, isn't it? And let me just repeat what I said at the start. The vision of the Cotonou Agreements would, if we put this through, deprive them, the populists, of their cynical and deadly rhetoric. And thank you at least for giving me the possibility to finish.
Kiitokset, edustaja Michel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michel. Our next speaker is Mrs. Sanchez Caldente for the GUE-NGL. President, the European Union is going to renew the Cotonou Agreement, and that is the agreement that regulates our relations with around 80 countries from Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific, which includes some of the poorest countries in the world. Cotonou is an agreement that is very wide in scope, but it hasn't changed the situation of the extreme vulnerability that these countries have vis-à-vis the global economy in 20 years. Actually, what it's doing is ensuring that Africa remains a provider of natural resources. Africa fails to develop in spite of its wealth in natural resources. Food safety, food security remains a distant dream, and the fact is that big businesses and others continue to carry out human rights violations with impunity. So we need fair trade relations and the right to development for these countries. We need to ensure that the agreement is part of the 2030 Framework Agreement and the Paris Agreement. We need to include the gender perspective and put a stop to the exploitation of natural resources. We need to ensure that our businesses pay tax where they make their profits and show more transparency. They need to be responsible for what they do abroad. We need to boost small-scale industry and small-scale farming, which feeds the world, and we shouldn't condition our assistance to our own interests. We have a challenge ahead of us, which is to ensure that the EU becomes a genuine exporter of human rights, particularly in those areas where we've violated those for centuries. If you're doing that, you'll have the support of my group. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Sanchez Caldente. Mireille Dornano next, from the EFDD Group. You have 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, within the Council, disagreements amongst member states are such that the Cotonou Agreement might expire in 2020 without a new text having proven possible. The current negotiations on the post-Cotonou position are symptomatic of the dead end the European Union finds itself in. Article 218 of the TFEU is very clear regarding the procedure governing the negotiation of agreements. I quote, "The Council decides by unanimity on association agreements." That is why Hungary has blocked the negotiating mandate since the 22nd of May because of a disagreement about migration. Since then, a number of member states have opposed the compromise text, which would have made it possible to remove Hungary's opposition. Let's open our eyes, colleagues, and grasp the point that it's because the European treaties can only be amended by uniformity under the terms of Article 48 of the TFEU that we're defending France's departure from the EU so that we can decide freely.
Kiitos, edustaja Dornano.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Dornano. Our next speaker is Mr. Schaffhauser from the ENF Group. You have 1 minute, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner, our resolution is very positive on interparliamentary cooperation, but what we say is that bringing civil society, good governance and the fight against corruption together as part of an aid package is nevertheless helping Africans, as we saw in China, in Singapore, and sometimes in the past in our own countries. By budgetizing the EFD, we get an intergovernmental capacity which is indispensable for good cooperation according to subsidiarity. Now, the worst of this is that co-development ideas which gave privileged access for certain products and certain degree of protectionism for jobs and activities on the ground, that spirit is going to be abandoned in the Cotonou Agreement, and we will provide conditions for granting of aid which would be opening up of markets and will destroy in so doing the local African economy.
Kiitokset, edustaja Schaffhauser. Ja sitten
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaffhauser. James Carver now for the non-attached members. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, what strikes me most about this issue is it is certainly not an agreement between equals. This should be a policy towards that there is a level playing field. But when you read the fine detail, the ACP countries will be lucky to get the scraps from the EU's table, whilst the EU ensures continued access to cheap raw materials, whilst holding ACP states to difficult high standards of behaviour if they wish to continue receiving foreign aid from Brussels. Can you imagine what would happen to an ACP country if it behaved like, say, Spain has over the issue of Catalan independence? Substitute Catalonia for any other independence movement and suddenly the EU's hypocrisy becomes embarrassingly obvious. This report is nothing more than a form of blatant neo-colonialism. We should be supporting initiatives to enable ACP countries to prosper, not make them further dependent on aid regimes that have never worked nor ever will in their long-term best interests. Thank you.
Kiitokset, edustaja Carver. Sitten
Thank you, Mr. Carver. We now move on to individual speakers, and the first on the list is Mr. Zeller. 1.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Well, with the Cotonou Agreement, we wanted to regulate the relations between the EU and the 79 states of the African, Pacific and Caribbean countries. But this agreement runs out in 18 months. That's not a great deal of time for us to negotiate a new agreement. This makes it even more regrettable that the Council didn't even establish a negotiating mandate in May, so negotiations couldn't start. The problem was our side because our partners were already ready. Cotonou will run out in 2020. But since it was agreed, development hasn't stayed still. Many countries have, including China, have now got more influence than Europe, and so I think that we need to ensure that we have political dialogue and talk about issues such as human rights, for example. Now, the European Development Fund is the main tool that we use for development support, and that also concludes in 2020. We want an extension of that, but we're going to have it brought back into the EU budget. We have set out many things in our question, our oral question, and we would like a rapid answer for those questions. Now, next week the Joint Parliamentary Assembly will be meeting again. I hope that colleagues from the European Parliament will get involved, certainly more than last time we met, because we owe that to our colleagues from the ACP side. Thank you.
Kiitos, edustaja Zeller. Ja sitten...
Thank you very much, Mr. Zeller. Mrs. Kienge now, 2 minutes, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The opening of negotiations on the new partnership agreement between the EU and the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries provides us with a wonderful opportunity to improve the characteristics of the Cotonou Agreement and help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Stamping out poverty, respecting human rights, economic development and social development, the integration of the ACP countries in the global economy must all remain key points in the negotiations. But the challenge posed by the UN 2030 agenda and the 2016 agenda for the African Union have to be embodied in the new agreement. We have to fight climate change, work on migration and peace. We stress today again the role of migration in Europe. The new agreement between ACP countries and Europe cannot envisage migration solely in terms of repatriation. We need a holistic policy which will allow us to work towards eradicating poverty and the deep causes of migration. The President interjects. You're speaking rather fast, Ms. Kienge. Would you mind speaking a little more slowly? Ms. Kienge, regarding the future agreement, strengthening the parliamentary dimension is a requirement. We stress the need to consolidate political dialogue, guaranteeing the democratic continuation of our work. And that's why we welcome the possibility in the periodic ACP-EU meetings of including opposition and civil society. We have to work together increasingly with grassroots citizens and direct our work towards them. We have to strengthen youth and gender policies and build a system which will make it possible to monitor the respect for human rights, and together with civil society, promoting fundamental human rights have been a cornerstone of the Cotonou Agreement, and they must be an equally important part of the future agreement. Thank you.
Kiitos, edustaja Kienge.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kienge. I just please wanted to emphasize that we really need to speak a little bit more slowly to help the interpreters, so please, colleagues, speak slowly. Mr. Garika, now 1 minute.
Have you ever been to Kiribati in the Pacific? Do you know the Caribbean island Samana? Have you ever been to Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic? Commissioner Mimica, you'll know that development work in these regions has almost nothing to do with each other, and that takes us to the core problem of our ACP policy. And in the post-Cotonou process, I can't really see there being any change to that. We need a strong regionalisation of the ACP, and we need to focus on Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific together and yet separate. If we pursue our development policy pragmatically rather than ideologically and support projects on the ground rather than the budgets of corrupt palace-based regimes, and we support development to try and prevent human flight with, for example, the transaction tax, then we'll be more courageous than Macron and others together. And I think we will then be helping the poorest people, and this is my wish for the future of the ACP. Thank you.
Kiitokset, edustaja Gerikke. Sitten...
Thank you very much, Mr. Gericke. Mr. Goerens now, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. During the European Day of Development, I met the Guinean Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he said to me that he will be the future chief negotiator for the ACP, and he also told me that the ACP already has a negotiating mandate. Then we had a discussion, there were several of us there, discussing the reasons why the European side mandate was blocked. We asked the Commission who is causing the problem, and what we don't get is a response often, because the Commission doesn't like to name and shame. But you, as the Commission representative, I would ask you whether the following member states agree with the mandate as you have proposed it: the United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Malta, Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Portugal. You're not contradicting me, so from that I deduce that it's Hungary that's blocking the negotiations.
Kiitokset edustaja Goerens.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goerens. Mr. Ferreira now, 1 minute.
Senhora Presidente, Senhor Comissário, a relação futura.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, future of relations with the ACP countries must be based first and foremost on full respect for the independence and sovereignty of countries and respecting each people's will. The remainders of centuries of colonization still remain in current relations. There's asymmetrical relations here which affect cooperation for development, the fight against poverty, inequality and social injustice. Rather than trying to export models for organizing the state and the economy, the European Union must respect the legitimate options adopted by ACP countries. Rather than trying to perpetuate a dominant relationship in the so-called economic partnership agreements, the European Union should recognize the specific needs of ACP countries and the negative impact on them of policies to liberalize international trade. The European Union must respect the unity and diversity of the ACP countries.
Kiitos edustaja Ferreira ja sitten edustaja.
Thank you, Mr. Ferreira. Our next speaker is Mr. Pedicini. 2 minutes, please. Thank you, President. Well, until now, the Cotonou Agreement's been based on 3 pillars: development cooperation, political and economic cooperation, and trade cooperation. On trade policy, there's been a complete failure. Some EU countries have imposed neo-colonial agreements which only paid lip service to sustainable measures on environmental protection, etc. But actually what happened is that we imposed our products on them at high prices, such as processed foods, pharmaceuticals or mobile phones. And while this was going on, some countries, like France, scooped up raw materials from countries such as the Congo, fossil fuels in Nigeria, uranium in Niger, cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, among others. Political cooperation should have been one of the key parts of the Cotonou Agreement, but until this point it hasn't got even close to achieving that stability that we're all looking for. It actually seems that insecurity is being fueled and even encouraged, so that the weapons trading and migrant trading businesses can be funded. Political dialogue is a key aspect of the Cotonou Agreement, and we believe that it should remain a key pillar of the future framework. I mean, moving on to trade, if we don't think about human rights when we look at the trade part and ensuring that civil society is involved at all levels, the new agreement will fail, as the previous one did. Now, when it comes to development cooperation, I'm not afraid to stand up and say that this is limited to isolated intergovernmental measures which are not under the control of civil society and parliaments. The Joint Parliamentary Assembly, and specifically the Joint Council meeting of ministers, have really produced very few tangible results. There's been minimal participation at a very low level. Development cooperation should have had the goal of eliminating poverty, but unfortunately none of that's happened. I've still got 30 seconds, ma'am. So we expect the new agreement to seriously affirm conditions relating to protecting human rights and boost political dialogue, providing tangible, clear instruments to defend the values of the ACP-EU partnership. Thank you.
Send off.
Well, for me it seems you have 2 minutes.
I had 2 minutes send off. I told to bring.
Mennään sitten eteenpäin. Edustaja György Hölvényi.
Okay, well, let's carry on then. Mr. Hölvényi.
Tisztelt képviselőtársaim, 3 konkrét.
Thank you very much. There are 3 points that I'd like to stress. First of all, we need a proper agreement, and we don't wish to make reference to religious groups. It's very difficult to fight poverty if we make reference. I mean, if we think about the Conference of Bishops in Congo and the role of mediation they played, we should therefore be including them. But so we shouldn't be omitting the churches. We also need to think about the situation as regards trying to improve human rights. Obviously, we do need to take steps to combat autocratic regimes. Then there's paragraph 19 of the motion. I don't agree with that. I think the people who are in danger need to be helped, but as far as our migration policy is concerned, we shouldn't lead these people up the garden path by suggesting that they could be integrated. We shouldn't lump refugees and asylum seekers in the same boat.
Thank you very much. We now have Mr. López Aguilar. Please, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, the EU's relations with the community of African, Caribbean and Pacific countries is undoubtedly the most strategic, longest standing and partnership with a wealth of experience we've built up. Cotonou started in 2000, it was revised in 2005, 2010, so we have plenty of experience to draw conclusions from there. I want to stress political dialogue and institutional capacity for strengthening the judiciary, guarantees for the separation of powers, and fighting corruption too. And the parliamentary dimension too, of course, because that's what the EU ACP Joint Assembly is all about. It exists in order to make sure that there's accountability on the part of the signatory countries in the way they proceed. But I have to add that it's unacceptable to link this strengthening of cooperation with the way we deal with migration, let alone the returns policy. That's completely out of the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. López Aguilar. Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Wisniewska. 1 minute.
Dziękuję bardzo, Pani Przewodnicząca. Szanowni Państwo, dziś pochylamy się nad odnowieniem.
Well, yes, thank you very much, President. Today we're talking about renewing the Cotonou Agreement, 18 years since it came into force. Now, half of ACP countries are part of the group of poorest countries in the world. Their share of global trade is less than 5% and 2% of global production. The problem now is uncontrolled migration, which is a major threat for the development of ACP countries, because these are young, strong and brave people leaving their countries. These people could make a major contribution to developing their homelands. I agree that we need more effective mechanisms when it comes to returns and readmissions policies. The European Union should be supporting ACP countries in situ and helping their economies. As representatives of the European Union, we would say, do you want to see a situation in which the youngest, strongest and bravest people leave Africa? Because Africa will then become a dying continent. This migration policy has not been reflected on and it's not achieving good results. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Ms. Zovko, you have 1.5 minutes.
Signor Presidente, Poštovani predsjedavajući, poštovani povjereniče, očekujem da današnja rasprava pridonese učinkovitijim pregovorima o novom sporazumu o partnerstvu.
I expect today's discussion to lead to a better partnership between the European Union and the ACP countries. The European Union has to use the opportunity that is offered in this new partnership agreement after Cotonou, and development aid has to be the main instrument of public diplomacy. Development aid that the European Union is offering has to be a tool for a more efficient external policy. This is how we are going to prevent security threats that the European Union shows towards countries that want stability. The cooperation of the EU with ACP countries has to contribute at a global level to security and peace. European Union has historical links and partnerships with these countries. Therefore, we have to efficiently manage migration, increase the mobility of students, facilitate investment programs, and also hinder smuggling networks. We also have to collect and exchange information and help countries that are in crisis.
Thank you.
Non c'è, allora il prossimo oratore, onorevole Seinfeld, 1 minuto e 30, prego.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It would appear that European Union policy vis-à-vis the ACP countries has failed. In any case, success in the foreign policy arena of the EU has been rather few and far between, and we now need to think about exactly what we've achieved with our relations with the ACP countries. Peace? No. These countries are often the arena of war, and often very violent war. Cooperation on democracy? No. There's no democracy. Respect of human rights? No. That's just on paper. Next, economic development? Politics? No. Let's not even mention it. Why am I saying this? Why am I putting it in such a direct way, so brutally? It's because everybody that's been working on this agreement, I think they should try and avoid making the same mistakes they made for the last 40 years. You really cannot copy and paste the same agreement which has turned out to be a failure. And one of the main reasons for that failure of our policy is that the policy was actually based on a simple objective, which was aid, assistance aid. And if aid is the only instrument, the outcome is that money ends up getting wasted. And capital is wasted. It's not just money, but human capital, time, effort. It's all wasted. And if these agreements are to be based upon a proper partnership to bring about very precise objectives rather than just the handing out of free aid, then that would be better. That would be more likely to be efficient, and certainly if we look at what the US has done, this has been much more successful in a shorter period of time, and these countries don't just become targets for development aid, but actually try to set about achieving very specific objectives. That should be our intention.
Thank you. Ms. Reinhardt for 1 minute. Thank you, President. The new agreement has to be based very much on the 2030 agenda, with a mechanism which will make it possible to monitor progress achieved by both sides as we work towards the new Sustainable Development Goals. Particular attention has to be devoted to what were the essentials of the Cotonou Agreement regarding human rights and democratic principles and the rule of law. They must remain the foundation of our cooperation. We also have to fight tax evasion. Developing countries are already paying the highest price for that. And on migration, we call upon the Council and the Commission to stop continuing on the shameful path of recent years, trying to link aid to tougher border controls. Unfortunately, the policy seems to be far too much jigged towards repatriation. In the new partnership, we mustn't abandon the fight against poverty. This is the way to underpin rights and real development for everyone's benefit. Thank you. Mr. Zurchinho has the floor now for 1 minute. Thank you, President. In a world characterized by uncertainty and shifting geopolitical realities, the negotiations on this partnership agreement between the EU and the ACPs provide an opportunity to establish a framework for cooperation based on respect for, on the one hand, human rights, the participation of civil society and sustainability, principles which are crucial to a fair humanist model of globalization. I also wish to stress that the global position of our two blocs have to be able to retain the structure of their relationship without detriment to strengthening the regional level of their specific approaches. We have to fight forced migration and phenomena of poverty and extreme inequality which are corroding 21st century societies. And that's why today's resolution is an embodiment of the European Parliament's commitment to the future.
Ward, prego, un minuto.
Thank you, Ms. Ward. 1 minute.
As an active member of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, I've witnessed the importance of this framework. For post-Cotonou, I trust the Council will negotiate an EU-ACP relationship anchored in upholding the values of democracy, human rights, gender equality and the rule of law. One which will enable a vibrant and active civil society, including the work of human rights defenders. For instance, in DRC, all Lucia and Filimbi members should be released, as well as detained human rights defenders. The focus of our work together with our partners at governmental and parliamentary level should be to ensure human dignity is respected everywhere. A strong focus on culture and education is also crucial. We need to make sure that intercultural dialogue becomes a key component of the ACP framework in order to use people-to-people contact as a means of achieving peace and prosperity. I also believe it's crucial to include a strong parliamentary dimension in order to strengthen the democratic foundation of our unique partnership.
Grazie, onorevole Frunzulica, prego.
Thank you. Ms. Frunzulica, you have a minute.
Grazie, Presidente. Chers collègues, Monsieur le Commissaire, les négociations dans la...
Colleagues, Commissioner, well, the negotiations for the post-Cotonou Agreement is an opportunity to renew EU-ACP relations so that we can tackle the joint challenges that we face. I welcome the architecture for future cooperation between ACP-EU countries proposed by the Commission, but I would like to emphasise that the Sustainable Development Programme with a view to 2030, as well as the European Consensus for Development, need to be at the core of the future partnership. In addition, it's essential for the fight against poverty to remain a central element of the new agreement, as should conditions linked to human rights, including explicit references to the need for monitoring and review mechanisms if there is not respect for human rights. In addition, it is essential to involve civil society in political dialogue, and I'd like to reiterate that its full participation needs to be a binding element of the partnership. To conclude, let me insist on the importance to boost the parliamentary dimension of the future agreement by ensuring that the future Joint Parliamentary Assembly has open, democratic and global dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Arena, you have 2 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The partnership agreement between the European Union and the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries has been extremely important, and today we must take up a new position in the context of a European EU ACP agreement for the future. And if we were to ask European citizens about post-Cotonou, I think there'll be very few people who would know what we were talking about. Same would apply for citizens in Africa, the Caribbean or the Pacific. were we to ask them, they simply wouldn't really know what we were talking about. And the first challenge, therefore, that we have to face, we Europeans and also our partners, is to ensure that in these agreements there should be familiarity for those affected, and in civil society there should be a full involvement in the context of the discussions on this agreement. So civil society must be fully implicated in the working out of the new agreement, and it seems to me that Europeans and African, Caribbean and Pacific population should be well informed of what we're up to. Secondly, the parliamentary side of all of this has been important, and maybe there are things, and I'm sure there are things that need to be improved so that we parliamentarians can actually set down a few priorities and challenges between the European continent and the African continent and the Caribbean and the Pacific are very important. We've got environmental challenges, we've got demographic challenges, we've got challenges about how we use the world's resources and how we manage things democratically. All of that needs to be discussed. And I'm rather sad today to see that when we are talking with these countries, we tend to focus exclusively on migration, and that migration is a great wealth really that we should be sharing with these countries. And I think that the future of Cotonou will be that we can also project ourselves into a common future with these countries, and I hope that we'll succeed in doing that, facing up to the challenge that we have.
Thank you, Miriam. And now for the Catch the Eye procedure, we'll take Mr. Marias first.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. The political and economic relations of the EU, the ACP countries, must be based on mutual interest. But in Africa, the European multinational grab the raw materials, the land, and exploit cheap labor of millions. And we are in competition with the Russians to create food monopolies. On the other hand, the imports of agricultural goods from Africa to Europe destroys our agriculture, destroys any protection for products that are protected, like the Greek feta, and for other products with designated area of production. And so we export to them industrial products, and they export agricultural. And they also export millions of illegal immigrants. They come into the European Union. We must take measures to protect the human rights, to ban child labor and the exploitation of women, and to implement the principles of the Cotonou Agreement.
Ms. Senra Rodriguez, you have 1 minute. Thank you, President. Commissioner, if the purpose of eradicating poverty in the ACP countries is a sincere one, then we need a new framework for our relations which will bring an end to the current situation where the European Union imposes agreements which are based on complete inequality and which allow us to remove resources, raid their fishing banks, go for a land grab and disrupt their agriculture markets. I believe that unfair agreements between the EU and the ACP countries have not helped economic development in those countries because the agreements have perpetuated poverty. They just want cheap labour, low production costs, lax environmental rules, and we want to open up their borders so that multinationals can trade their products with lower tariffs or zero tariffs. So there's an urgent need for a new framework for cooperation which will really pursue development, an end to poverty, and be based on sovereignty and respect for those peoples. Thank you. The President, Mr. Zdrojewski, for 1 minute.
Zajmuję się polityką obronności, polityką bezpieczeństwa i tak patrzę na Afrykę.
Well, security policy, defense policy, These are all important things, and also I look to the African continent in terms of dramatic events and threats that come from there and take place on that continent too often, unfortunately. But like my colleague Mr. Zeller, I believe that we need a legal framework, a political framework, so that we can act in an effective way and react to events that take place in Africa in an appropriate manner. I also agree with what Mr. Scheinfeld said. He gave us his diagnosis of matters, and I don't think we can be satisfied with what we've achieved, or better said, not achieved in Africa in terms of trade policy, economic policy and stabilising the situation. I mean, basically we've achieved very little indeed. I would like the European Parliament and European Union work on these renewed agreements, but in doing so they should recall the most important objectives that we have, and that they look at new techniques to better stabilise the situation in Africa, because otherwise we will simply be spending money to assuage our consciences, nothing more.
Mr. Carver, for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Commissioner, we all know of the crucial importance of the ACP-EU partnership, the great steps forward in fighting poverty that have been accomplished, the huge challenges that still remain ahead of us too, though. There are many possible ways forward for the new partnership. Various factors are of equal importance, but we mustn't overlook what I regard as the most crucial point, namely the financing of this. Budgetising the European Development Fund is something that should be welcomed, but we have to make sure it remains targeted on its purposes. The new Development Cooperation Instrument has not delivered yet. On the contrary, it seems that the binding of development funds, the ring-fencing development funds, will actually be undermined by budgetary constraints. If we fail to ensure that the funds for development are duly challenged, we will have missed the main target in our development cooperation effort, and that will have an impact for decades to come. Thank you. Ms. Pietikainen, you have the floor.
Uudet neuvottelut tarjoavat mahdollisuuden nykyaikaista ja komission ehdotus 3 alueellisesta kumppanuudesta Afrikan, Karibian ja Tyynenmeren kanssa onkin erittäin tervetullut ja kannatettava pohja. Ja se myös vahvistaa kummankin alueen strategisia tavoitteita. Euroopan parlamentti on omalta osaltaan peräänkuuluttanut ihmisoikeuksia yhtenä kulmakivenä ja myöskin korostanut tasa-arvon edistämistä ja ilmastonmuutoksen torjuntaa. Se, minkä toivoisin voimakkaammin näkyvän tulevassa kumppanuussopimuksessa, on 3 asiaa. Ensinnäkin selvä viittaus ja kumppanuussopimuksen linjaaminen yhteen uusien kestävän kehityksen tavoitteiden kanssa ja niiden mittaaminen sitä vasten. Toinen on vahvempi naisten oikeuksien ote ja 3. on kiertotalouden edistäminen, ennen kaikkea aloittaen jätteistä.
The rights of women in the circular economy as well. We need a Europe without waste.
Thank you. And now Commissioner Mimica will have a chance to reply to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. President, honourable members. I would like to underline that what is at stake in the upcoming negotiations for a new partnership agreement with the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries is ultimately the role of the European Union as a global actor. It is my hope that the Council will shortly adopt a decision to entrust the Commission and the High Representative with the negotiations of objectives, strategic priorities and modalities of the EU to achieve such a global player's role with its ACP partners. Let me conclude by assuring you that the Parliament will be immediately and fully informed at all stages of the negotiation procedure. I am looking forward to continue the fruitful collaboration, and I remain certain that the Parliament will continue working to ensure that the European Union keeps on standing for its values. Thank you.
Grazie, signor Commissario.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now we'll give the floor for her reply to Ms. Panayatou, other Minister.
President, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this interesting exchange of views. It shows convergence of views on our side that the future ACP-EU partnership needs to be adapted to the new needs. This convergence is also due to the work of the European Parliament and the regular exchanges between all of us in the process of preparing the EU negotiating mandate. While we need to build on the achievements of the Cotonou framework, it is imperative that the future framework take better account of the interests, needs and challenges of the different regions of the ACP side. Concerning the questions of Mr. Vente and some of you, I would like to say that the Presidency will continue its efforts to allow the Council to adopt its mandate as soon as possible in order for the negotiations to start as envisaged. The Council will make its decision on the publication of the negotiating directives after we have agreed on the final text. The negotiation process will be crucial. The Council will contribute within the limits of its role to its successful progress and will continue its exchanges on this important topic with the European Parliament. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie, signora Ministra.
Thank you, Minister. That brings the debate to a close. I've received a motion to wind up the debate, and the vote will be taken tomorrow. We now go on to the next item on our agenda. Council and Commission information on the follow-up to the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies. I shall give the floor